Things seem to be running. Yeah. Things seem to be running a little slow tonight for some reason, but we've had little minor technical glitches in the past that we have made it through. It's good to see everybody. It's good to see Sherry here. And we've got a handful of people here tonight. And tonight we are going to finish up the third quarter and go one more evening discussing Tarhe. Tonight, we're going to add into the discussion Leatherlips and a prophet, as you see on the screen there. And our objectives are lying in a gore of blood. Doesn't that sound fun? The Americans, Indian chief, a state of debauchery, weaponized witchcraft, and pagan Christians. Some interesting little topics there that we'll go through. I will say, what we are going to talk about tonight spans a very brief 20 years. The signing of the Grenville Treaty was in 1795, and we'll see tonight the actual year that Tarhe died. So if you want to do the math, for 20 years from 1795 is when Tarhe actually died. When you look at the history books, there's a lot of contradictions. There's a lot of misunderstandings as to when he actually died. And when you look at the historical record, it doesn't take a lot of analysis to know that if Tarhe was actually alive in 1718 or died in 1718, like a lot of people say, he would have signed the Treaty of 1717 or 1817. But he didn't sign that treaty, which means that he wasn't there and he had died. So we will look at the time of his death tonight as well. And hopefully we'll kind of resolve a few of the little conflicts that the history books have gotten way wrong throughout the last couple of centuries. So I want to start off tonight basically talking about what happened from the perspective of Tarhe at the Treaty of Grenville. The minutes were actually recorded, and we can have access to those, and we can actually hear what Tarhe had to say. I've got quite a bit here from his quotes, but we're not going to take the time to read all of it. But there's a few things that really stand out that can give you the idea of what was going on through Tarhe's mind and how the nations were reacting to him, how the Americans reacted, and what his end goal was. And this is the beginning of Tarhe's speech on Wednesday, the 22nd of July in 1795. And he starts off, "Elder brother, now listen. The Great Spirit above has appointed this day for us to meet together. I shall now deliver my sentiments to you, the 15 fires. I view you lying in a gore of blood. It is me, an Indian, who caused it. Our tomahawk yet remains in your head. The English gave it to me to place there." So that's some pretty powerful words from Tarhe, explaining what they have done up to this point. And then he goes on to say, "Elder brother, I now take the tomahawk out of your head, but with so much care that you shall not feel pain or injury." And then he goes on to talk about how he's going to take that tomahawk, rip up a gigantic tree and throw the tomahawk into this hole where the roots once were. Then he's going to put the tree back in. The water's going to wash away the tomahawk, and there will be never again any war between he and the Americans. We won't take the time to read all of it, but Tarhe's basically telling them that he's not going to fight anymore. He caused a lot of pain to the Americans. He was the one who put the tomahawk into the head of the Americans, and now he's pulling it out. No more war. But you'll notice in here, if we go back to the first screen, he refers to the Americans as elder brother. He is looking at the United States of America as an equal to himself, as an equal to the Wyandotte Nation and all the other nations. And then a couple of days later, things change a little bit. On August 7th, Tarhe says this: "Brothers, listen, and you also brothers of the different nations present, the Great Spirit above has appointed this day for us to complete all the good work in which we have engaged." So we are getting close to the time in which the treaty is actually signed, and Tarhe has basically held off throughout the duration of the conference in making one massive declaration, the declaration that the general wants and the president wants and everybody back in Washington, D.C. wants. Tarhe is reluctant to actually give them the pleasure of hearing him say until this day. So another little piece here, and then we get to the actual monumentous declaration, the huge declaration that Tarhe has to say. And he says, "Father, you see, we all now acknowledge you to be our Father. I take you by the hand, which I offer as a pledge of our sincerity and of our happiness in becoming your children." Whoa. Tarhe, the great chief of the Wyandotte Nation, basically just acknowledged the existence of the United States of America. He pulled back from calling the United States an equal to himself. He pulled back from saying that they were a brother to him. Now he acknowledges the United States as the father of the nations. And that was a massive declaration that was made by Tarhe at the Treaty of Grenville. And we will see as we progress here, some people actually really liked what he did there and others didn't. And from that declaration there, the other nations followed his lead, and he dared to do what no other chief did. He acknowledged the existence of the 15 fires, which the 15 fires that he acknowledged were the 15 states of the United States at that time in history. And as we've already seen, the United States was no longer a brother. They were no longer an equal. They were now given the status of being father, which was above the nations. And the other nations followed his lead, at least those that were there at the signing of the treaty. Tarhe was wise enough to know that he could not, that he and the nations, the alliance that they had formed, they could not, under any circumstances, continue to fight the Americans. Doing so would have been an absolute death wish. So what he did was he had the wisdom to know when the fight had finished and when the fight was no longer valid for the nations, and he called for peace. These are the nations that actually signed the Treaty of Grenville. And you'll see that there's a couple on here listed twice, like the Potawatomi. There were two different bands. Each had to sign. Same thing with the Delaware, the Miami as well. So all these nations here agreed to the terms of the Treaty of Grenville. And the last discussion that we had a little confusion as to who actually signed the treaty. Which of our citizens signed. So I went back and pulled up the treaty and found where I made the error. I had only just a small portion of the treaty that showed the marks of our chiefs. And looking at the whole treaty, these are our chiefs that actually signed. And I'm going to point out just a few of them, because some of these I'm not familiar with. Some of these men, I don't know who they are. But the ones of importance are obviously Tarhe. Down here, we have Half King's son, and his name is spelled like I have never seen it before. But Half King's son is going to be important in the coming years. And Half King, he had several sons, and all of them but one were killed during the time of the border wars. And there is one story about Half King's son that is just, it's a legend among the border wars, and that is a Bigfoot. So if you're not familiar with Bigfoot, one of Half King's sons and what he did, Google him or let me know and I'll send you some stuff on Bigfoot. It's a phenomenal story. And it was actually a legend that was spoke for many, many years around the United States. But in conjunction with Half King's son, clearly Roundhead did sign the treaty. and also Leatherlips was also on the treaty. So these four men, Tarhe, Half King's Son, Roundhead, and Leatherlips, we'll look at a little bit more. But the Treaty of Grenville was followed by comparative peace for a period of 16 years. And until about the year 1811, although in the meantime turbulent, revengeful, and evil-disposed Indians frequently broke away from the different tribes and from the control of their principal chiefs and formed marauding parties, which from time to time committed all manner of murders, thefts, and outrages on the frontier settlements of the Northwest. So even though Tarhe, the other chiefs, the nations had signed the Treaty of Peace, there was still these skirmishes that were ongoing. There were some bands, one, as we will see here in a little bit, among the Shawnee, that absolutely did not agree with the Grenville Treaty, and they were under no circumstances going to honor the request of their chiefs and lay down the tomahawk. Some of the tribes and personalities believed that by signing the treaty, Tarhe had capitulated to the Americans. He had become an Indian traitor. In actuality, the actions and promotions of Tarhe likely kept the tribes from being destroyed by the Americans. General Anthony Wayne, after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, was powerfully prepared to take his destruction of the tribes from the battlefield into their homes. Tarhe's peace kept this from happening. So Tarhe was given basically two different perspectives. There were some people that looked at him as being an absolute traitor to all the nations. What he did was he signed a treaty with the Americans. He capitulated, he laid prone in front of them, and he called them father. They absolutely despised Tarhe for that. While others recognized the fact that what Tarhe did saved their lives. So Tarhe is one of our chiefs that you either loved or you hated. There was really no middle ground with the nations at that time. He was loved or he was despised. And after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Miami's Little Turtle, who was basically the war chief, he was chief of the Miami, he was the war chief that led the coalition against the Americans. After the battle, he just kind of begins to fade away into history. He just goes away. But Tarhe, he remains a constant influence for the next 20 years until the day of his death. Tarhe settled into a new life without war. The Wyandot people settled into a new life without war, and we'll see here in a bit, that was a huge change for them. Tarhe established a relationship with Reverend Joseph Badger, and he learned how to live with the Americans through the counsel of Reverend Badger. And a lot of people are unfamiliar with Joseph Badger and what he did for the tribe. He was basically stepping into a role of not only just a missionary, but a consultant. He took, as most people do when they step into the world of Wyandot people, Reverend Badger absolutely fell in love with our people, which is not hard to do. A lot of people that came into the tribe, they are just enamored by who we are as a people. And Reverend Badger was one, and he had a really close relationship with Tarhe. And along with that relationship with an independent missionary, Tarhe also had a really good relationship with the United States military. And being associated with a missionary and with the military, again, even hardened some of those nations that despised Tarhe. It hardened their hearts even more against him. The relationship that Tarhe had with the United States military was very strong. During the War of 1812 at Upper Sandusky, there was Fort Fier. And from there is where most of the commanders of the United States Army basically had their back fort. That's where a lot of the generals were, and it was at Upper Sandusky, basically a little bit from Cranestown, where Tarhe lived, and it was basically our capital. And today, where the fort actually resided is in the area where the Elks Lodge can currently be found in Upper Sandusky. So that relationship that Tarhe had with the military was strong enough that he let them build a fort right in our capital city, if you will. Tarhe, as we have seen, is both loved and despised. And that also extended all the way to Detroit. There were a number of citizens in Detroit that had mixed feelings about Tarhe. And those mixed feelings extended all the way back to whenever he was chosen as chief. When he was chosen, it kind of stepped on a few toes in Detroit. And a lot of the people there had never set aside those feelings. And then all of a sudden, here comes other things at play. Tarhe signed the treaty. We'll see here in a little bit that a prophet shows up, and it kind of split the tribe between Detroit and Upper Sandusky. Tarhe was a citizens chief. Tarhe was always out. He was among his people. He interacted with them. He knew what was going on. He knew the heart of his people because he was in the villages. He went from village to village to village. He was with his people constantly. So he knew the sentiments that they had. He knew the feelings that they wanted in regards to peace or war. And Tarhe was a chief that followed the wishes of his people. And at that time, the majority of the Wyandot people did not want to fight any longer. And a good way that we could look at how Tarhe was is look at Chief Leiford Bearskin. There are a lot of similarities in the way that Tarhe and Chief Bearskin basically commanded themselves. They were also great among their citizens. They cared, they loved their citizens. They were a part of their citizens, and everybody had easy approach to both of the men. And Tarhe and Chief Bearskin are very, very, very similar personalities. The tribes were very fluid at that time. They often crossed paths. Brownstown was still the area in which most of the tribes got together and had council. So there was this constant influx of tribes across the northern part of Ohio. There was the Black Swamp that caused a little bit of problems, but the tribes had a lot of fluidity. The rogue elements within several of the tribes were right there in the middle of all these little continued conferences that were going on. And as we've seen, one in particular, the Shawnee prophet, hated Tarhe. He became an ardent enemy of Tarhe and a good portion of the Wyandot people. Alcohol and witchcraft after the Battle of Fallen Timbers became a scourge of the nations. Alcohol was a weapon that had been identified by the British several years earlier as being a very cheap way of eliminating the tribes. And the alcohol has an affinity to the Indians, and the alcohol was destroying the Wyandot nation. Without even so much as a fight left against the Americans, the tribal citizens began to fight among themselves, and alcohol was the fuel. It was the catalyst that caused many of those internal conflicts to start brewing up. As one example, Between the Logs. Between the Logs is one of my uncles, and he actually killed his mate during a drunken rage. And we'll see a little bit later, Between the Logs, he had an important role that he played at this particular time in history. And next week, when we look at the next rendition of the studies here, we'll take another look at Between the Logs. He plays two roles here, but Between the Logs was one of those who actually had fallen victim to the alcohol. And for the rest of his life, he was haunted by the fact that he actually killed his mate, killed her dead in their cabin. And the Shawnee prophet, along with the alcohol that was destroying the nation, began to weaponize witchcraft. And he began to step into the nation's business, and he began to purge the nations of his enemies, those that were against him and those that he felt were unworthy to exist. And he began the witch hunts. And for several years, there were witch hunts that were taking place among the nations, and the nations were almost powerless to stop it. So a little bit more about Tarhe. And this is a big one that a lot of people never stop to think about. And when we read this, it might cause a little bit of pause. When the designated representative of the Friends, when the Friends missionaries arrived at Upper Sandusky in the following year, which was 1799, They found shocking and terrible scenes of drunkenness and were subjected to indignities. Tarhe himself was not able to meet them for a day or two because of his intoxicated condition. They were then informed that the council would not meet for 10 days, when the matter of instruction of religion and agriculture would be taken up. So Tarhe himself, our great chief, had fallen victim to the alcohol. And it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that somebody as strong, as powerful as Tarhe himself could have been lying in a drunken stupor in the middle of his cabin, unable to even consult with the people who come to his village. It kind of blows our minds, but that was the general state of a majority of our citizens at that time. And when I first read this quote here, it's just gripping. John Stewart worked his way up the Ohio River among the Wyandots, who were then represented as the most abandoned and vicious tribe, having sunk into the most degraded vices such as drunkenness, lewdness, and gambling, until many of them became the most debauched and worthless of their race. Wow. That's who our ancestors were, worthless of their race. That's pretty harsh words, but when you take a look at what was actually going on in the area, the Grand Reserve had not been formed at this point. It didn't exist. But in that area of Ohio, from Upper Sandusky to Lower Sandusky, all the way up to the Detroit area, was just carnage. Our citizens were just being wasted away from the alcohol and from the witchcraft that had gripped the nation. Another quote here, again, talking about Between the Logs, because as we saw, Between the Logs killed his mate. And Between the Logs was actually an emissary. Today, we could see Between the Logs as Secretary of State of the Wyandot Nation. Between the Logs was one of Tarhe's most trusted emissaries. He was a confidant, Secretary of State. And Tarhe sent Between the Logs basically to go check out, first and foremost, the Seneca prophet, because before the Shawnee prophet, the Seneca prophet came in and he was causing a lot of problems. A lot of people began to look at him as being the savior. Between the Logs went to check him out and found out, nah, he's just an imposter. And the same thing with the Shawnee prophet and his brother, Tecumseh. Tarhe sent Between the Logs, where he went to live at Prophetstown for about a year, looking intensely at what was going on with the prophet and Tecumseh. And Between the Logs returned back to Tarhe and basically told him that they're false. The prophet is a false prophet. We shouldn't be following him. Nothing that he's doing is right. It's all wrong. Tecumseh just happened to be following the coattails of his brother and fell right into that same lot. And here we can see a big event that took place, and this is often left out of the history books. And this is where a lot of the problems really began between the Shawnee prophet and Tarhe. In the latter part of June 1810, I procured a boat and 2 hands for a voyage to Sandusky. So Reverend Badger, he's at Sandusky, and he arrived there on a Saturday, and he was beginning to prepare for the Sabbath. While they were there was a lot of confusion within the village because the Shawnee prophet himself was in the village. And along with him, there was also most likely Tarhe. And they were trying to point out all the witches that were in need of being destroyed. And they had succeeded prior to this event in killing Leatherlips and 2 other Wyandot citizens who were women. So by this time, the extent of what was going on with the Shawnee prophet had touched our people directly. The prophet began to target the citizens of various tribes, our citizens. He used witchcraft as a weapon. Tarhe was accused of witchcraft and sentenced to death. The Shawnee's chief Blackhoof was also sentenced to death because of the accusation of witchcraft. And Blackhoof was the Shawnee prophet and Tecumseh's head chief. So they basically doomed their own chief to death because of their sentence of witchcraft. Chief Blackhoof and Tarhe, they both were honoring the terms of the Treaty of Grenville. Chief Blackhoof was right in line. He was a confidant of Tarhe, and he agreed with everything that Tarhe was saying. And because of that, he had the mark on his back. Leatherlips was accused of witchcraft. And a lot of us are very familiar with Leatherlips, and we'll see here in a little bit, his story is all messed up in the history books. But Leatherlips was accused of witchcraft, and we just saw on the previous page that he was killed. He was killed because of his loyalty to Tarhe and his loyalty to the peace that the treaty had basically established. Where he was able to be reached, Tarhe and Blackhoof, they were untouchable. But Leatherlips was very vulnerable and would pay a price. Leatherlips, much like Between the Logs, was a close and trusted friend and advisor of Tarhe. Leatherlips, like Tarhe and Roundhead, were all citizens of the Porcupines. Leatherlips, Tarhe, Roundhead were warriors. Leatherlips was an honored and elder warrior, and it's likely because of his age. Leatherlips was about the same age as Tarhe, and at this time, Leatherlips had basically exceeded the age in which he could serve as warpole. He was beyond 60 years of age. Because of exceeding his age, a younger war chief would stand up, and that be Roundhead. And Roundhead was actually serving as warpole of the nation, which is the war chief of the tribe. And Roundhead, like many other citizens, he fell to the vexation of the Shawnee prophet. And here in a little bit, we'll see that he paid a tremendous price for his disloyalty to his chief. Roundhead was loyal to Tecumseh. A lot of people think that he was loyal to the Shawnee prophet, but he was not. Tecumseh actually did not believe that what his brother was doing was right. Tecumseh did not really fall in line with all the witchcraft that his brother was spewing out there among the nations. It kind of divided him and his brother a little bit. And Roundhead was loyal to Tecumseh and not the prophet. And because of that, we'll see here in a little bit that the mistake was made of Roundhead being the executioner of Leatherlips, when in fact there is no way possible that he was. Tecumseh was not a proponent, as we see, of the prophet's tactics. Tecumseh and Roundhead, neither of them are known to have engaged in witchcraft. Roundhead sided with Tecumseh against the Americans. Roundhead defied his chief. Roundhead defied Tarhe, and because of that, he was convicted of outlawry. Outlawry was a tribal crime we'll look at here in a second, that Roundhead paid a horrible price for. Roundhead lost the protection of his clan, and he lost the protection of his tribe when he defied Tarhe and was convicted of outlawry. There are two different levels of the outlawry that can be invoked upon people. One, you're basically just excommunicated. You are cast out with no protection of clan or tribe, and you are basically on your own. You're no longer a citizen of the nation. The second degree of outlawry means that whatever it is that you have done, if you are seen by any other citizen of the nation, you are killed on sight. You are a marked man, you are a marked woman. And because of that mark, if you're seen, you're killed. And we have a couple of instances where we can see that play out. One we talked about a couple of months ago, where the Prairie Turtle and the Hawk clans were basically marked for extermination because of their involvement in witchcraft. And there is one more instance that time doesn't permit for us to talk about tonight, but we'll talk about that in coming episodes. And we'll have more time then to discuss one other event that came into play. And Most of the outlawry was done on an individual level, such as what happened with Roundhead. Recently, I'm going to mention this, it's a little close at heart, but recently we had another instance where one of our citizens was taken from the tribe through a sentence of outlawry. It's not really looked in and worded that way today, but Jim Bland also felt the pressures, the conviction of what happened several years back, about 20 years ago now. And he was convicted basically of outlawry, and Jim Bland lost his citizenship with the nation. And that is basically what happens when a conviction of outlawry happens. At that time, Roundhead was the one that felt the sting of being basically without a nation. The institution of outlawry exists among the Wyandots. It's unique, it's different. It has been used on a number of occasions, and it is a serious offense for a citizen to have to be convicted of. Again, the two grades here that we already discussed. And now, weaponized witchcraft. So everybody is familiar with Leatherlips. We have all heard of him. We have heard the story, but the story's all messed up. And two quotes here basically give Tecumseh as being one of the most powerful people at that time. It was the power of Tecumseh that led to Leatherlips being exterminated. The 6 Wyandots that put him to death were headed supposedly by Roundhead, but it was not Roundhead. It was not Tecumseh. It was not, as we saw up here, Leatherlips, the chief, which the chief would have been Tarhe. It was not Tarhe that killed Leatherlips. It was not Roundhead that killed Leatherlips. And the history books, depending upon what you read, accuse Tarhe and Roundhead of being the executioner. It's not. We won't take the time to read all of this, but here is President William Henry Harrison, who stepped up and basically came to Tarhe's defense. Tarhe had already died, and President William Henry Harrison steps up and basically says there is no way possible, after reading an account of the death of Leatherlips, that Tarhe could have been the executioner. We know from our own traditions that it was impossible for Tarhe to kill a fellow citizen of the Porcupines. For a porcupine to kill a porcupine would have been unheard of. It could not have happened. So porcupine killing porcupine was impossible. And William Henry Harrison said, no, Tarhe did not kill Leatherlips. And another that had been accused of killing Leatherlips was the son of the half-king. Scatosh was also accused of killing Leatherlips, and William Walker Jr. in the Draper manuscript stepped up and said it was just craziness of all the misrepresentations in Indian history. And William said, I have read and heard many. This about Scatosh's agency in the murder of Leatherlips takes them all. So knowing that there are a lot of really bad representations of what happened to Leatherlips, knowing that Leatherlips was a victim of this weaponized witchcraft, let's just take a few moments, and we're pushing a little bit of time. Let's take a few moments and see what actually happened. And we'll go through it really quick. In 1810, June 1st, 4 party of Wyandotte warriors were getting close to finding where Leatherlips was located. Leatherlips was basically on a retreat. He and one of his friends had gone to the favorite hunting place that they had, which was near present-day Dublin, Ohio. And it was there, which was about 2 miles north of a homestead. Benjamin Sells had a homestead, and he knew Leatherlips. And it was 2 miles north of his homestead that this camp had been made by Leatherlips. And John Sells, which was a relative of Benjamin, knew of the location of where this camp was. And after this party of 4 Wyandotte warriors came and knocked on the door of Benjamin Sells and asked, where is Leatherlips? Benjamin Sells basically was pushed in the corner because you got 4 Wyandots knocking on your door, wanting to know where this man is. You're going to tell him where the man is. If you don't, you're probably going to get tomahawk in your head. So Benjamin Sells basically gave up Leatherlips. He knew that he was 2 miles north, and this party of 4 Wyandotte warriors went immediately north to the camp of Leatherlips. The next day, Benjamin came in, found out what happened, so he goes running up there as well. When he gets up there to the camp of Leatherlips, he finds that Leatherlips has been bound. He has been customarily bound with a small cord. His hands were not actually tied. There was this small cord that had been draped over his wrist, and that was being symbolic of basically being captured, of being under arrest, of losing your freedom. And Leatherlips did not contest that because he knew what was going on. Leatherlips had also been presented with a piece of bark. That piece of bark had a painted tomahawk. The painted tomahawk basically was a sentence of death, and it came directly from Prophetstown, sent on behalf of the prophet himself with the 4 warriors that delivered it to Leatherlips. So he was bound by a small cord. He was given a piece of bark painted with a tomahawk, and he was convicted and sentenced to death, convicted of witchcraft. And Leatherlips, after a 2 to 3 hour conference where he basically debated back and forth with these 4 warriors about his fate, conceded to his fate because he knew there was no way he was getting out. He knew that no matter what happened, if he tried to flee, he would be killed. If he consented, he was going to be killed. This was the day of his death. So rather than resist, he just let fate take its course. While all this was going on, John Sells, who had a good relationship with Leatherlips, basically tried to bargain for his life. John Sells tried to get Leatherlips in exchange for a horse. And at that time, tradition was that if you had something of value and there was a citizen in the tribe that was going to be killed, you could trade the life for a valuable object. John Sells knew that tradition. He tried to trade Leatherlips for a horse, but the captain, as the executioner is fondly referred to, basically said no. So about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Leatherlips was led to a very shallow grave that had been dug away from his camp, and he and the captain kneeled in prayer. While he had finished praying, or shortly after he had finished praying, Leatherlips basically stood up on his knees, and he was struck by one of the warriors. The warriors had hid the instrument of death, which was a tomahawk, underneath a capote, which was a robe that was made out of a blanket. And this tomahawk fell out from the blanket, and he was struck no less than 3 to 4 times. Oh, not sin. Let's change that. He got struck in the head, and it split Leatherlips' head wide open. And for the first strike and the second strike, it did not kill Leatherlips, which at that point, the captain basically rejoiced, saying that that was the ultimate sign that what they were doing was justified because of Leatherlips not instantly dying. That proved that he was indeed a witch. So after his death, Leatherlips was put into a shallow grave. He was covered up with a little bit of dirt, and everybody walked on, and Leatherlips just went into the oblivion of history. Wrong. Leatherlips was basically, he was almost made into a saint. Leatherlips became a individual that is seen everywhere in the history books. He became a powerful figure. Even in his death, he became a powerful figure among our peoples, and he at that time had great influence even in death. So who was the captain? Who was the person who actually assassinated Leatherlips? We know that it was not Skatosh. We know that it was not Tarhe. We know that it was not Roundhead. Before we go to the next slide, does anybody want to tell us who the actual assassin was? Does anybody know? Who?
Peter Gould.
Peter Gould, indeed. Peter Gould was identified by William Walker Jr. William Walker Jr. knew Peter Gould. He was a young man at the time that Peter was living, and he especially knew him because William identified him as belonging to his tribe, belonging to his clan. William Walker Jr. was Big Turtle. Peter Gould was Big Turtle. And it was Peter Gould who killed Leatherlips. History books do not say that because it was not an easy thing to sell a lot of books back on the East Coast when you find out that it wasn't the famous Tarhe, it wasn't the famous Roundhead, it wasn't the famous Katouche that killed Leatherlips, but this guy from Detroit that nobody knew. That doesn't sell books. So Tarhe, as we see here, he was revered by the Americans. He was revered by his own people. He was revered by a lot of other nations as well. And he became a giant among all the nations. And he is well represented in the history books. So Tarhe died in December of 1815 of unknown causes. Indians and whites alike attended Tarhe's funeral. People mourned, they wept at the death of Tarhe. The passing of Tarhe marked the ending of an era. Tarhe was buried in an unmarked and undisclosed location because Tarhe's enemies would have likely dug him up and desecrated his body. He was so despised by so many people at the time, yet at the same time, he was loved by so many people. And because of that hate that they had, Tarhe, we do not know where he is located, where his grave is to this very day. Tarhe's successor was Dongquat. And a massive change in the mindset of how the chiefs and the people related to the missionaries instantly happened when Dongquat took over from Tarhe. And Reverend James Finley said this about Dongquat. His native talent was not of high order, and he seemed incapable of any broad or liberal views. So overnight, with the passing of Tarhe to Dongquat, it's like the Wyandot Nation stepped even further back into this debauchery that had beset the tribe. And it wasn't until the following year in 1816 that things would change. The people were confused. The people needed a lot of help. The Catholics and alcohol had done them a lot of wrong. In all their offenses and misery, the people pretended that they were doing better than reality affirmed. The people were actively searching for something when someone found them. The people unexpectedly found the pearl of great price, the Lord Jesus Christ. So next week, in our next discussion, we're going to talk about the pagan Christians and what happened in 1816 when John Stuart stepped into what would become the Grand Reserve. So next week, pagan Christians in the discussion. And as usual, there is just a few of all the sources that go into putting this together tonight. And, hey, that's all. We're done. That was a little longer than we hoped, but that was a lot of stuff. But that is one 20-year span that is probably one of my favorite eras, a 20-year span. It's a phenomenal time in our history, and we could talk a lot more about it, but time's up. Any thoughts, questions, comments, anything on all of that? There were some things in there that probably a lot of us have never heard of before.
Lloyd, do we know who the other three warriors were, and was anything ever done to the four of them for their act or anything?
History does not name the other three warriors. We can safely assume that they were probably Big Turtle as well, but we do not know their names. I've not found any resources, and William Walker did not identify them along with Peter Gould. I have not seen where, obviously we don't know who those men were. I've not seen where they actually paid the price for taking out Leatherlips. I would imagine that they were marked by Tarhe. They were also given the sentence of outlawry, like what Roundhead was, because Tarhe and Leatherlips, they were close. They were brothers, not actual physical brothers from the same mother, but they were brothers from the porcupine. So I would imagine that they paid the price of death at some point.
Okay.
But we do not know their names. We just know Peter Gould because he was the one who was identified as being the captain. He was the leader. He was the executioner. not the one who actually dropped the hatchet, but he was the one in charge of the other three that were there with him.
Benjamin.
Hi, it's Karina from Ohio. Can I ask a clarifying question? So Peter Gould was Wyandotte, but of a different clan, the Big Turtle clan. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So I live about 15 minutes away from Dublin, and this has been an interesting story for me because, as you said, all the history is very incorrect. They refer to the Dublin Historical Society as Chief Leatherlips.
Right.
Is that a good way to refer to him, or should it be a different way?
There would have been a number of different offices, if you will, that would have carried the title of a chief. Because we had village chiefs. Every village that we had a chief that was basically instilled by the clan chief, because clan villages were basically predominantly populated by a single clan, or it was, in lack of a better way, you had ownership of a clan. So each village had the designation of a village chief. There was also chiefs, clan chiefs. There were war chiefs. There were other chiefs that basically served at different levels. So there were the potential to have many different chiefs at one time within the tribe. The best that I can find, and years ago, and I've over the years read so much stuff and I've collected so much stuff and I've lost a lot of it and I've preserved a lot of it. But years ago, I had found a letter that was written that spoke specifically of Leatherlips and the role that he played within the nation. And I have searched for years to try and relocate where that was. I can't find it, but from memory, Leatherlips was a warrior chief. He was one of the war chiefs. At least he was the war chief of the Porcupine clan. At that time, the Porcupines were the ones that basically supplied the nation with the war pole. The war pole was the war chief of war chiefs. The war chief, the war pole, had 3 men that served underneath him, because there had to be 3 men at any given time. Because if you look at what happened at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, all of our chiefs that were there, except for Tarhe, were killed. So there were chiefs and there were backups to the chief and a backup to the chief. There were 3 war chiefs. So it's very likely that Leatherlips was one of the 3 war chiefs that served on the War Pole's council. The war pole, as I mentioned, was Roundhead, mainly because Leatherlips had reached a point where age did not allow him to serve. He was beyond 60 years old. He still fought, but he couldn't serve in that leadership role. And he still was on the council as a war chief, whether it was of the War Post Council or just a war chief among the Porcupines. We don't know for certain, but Leatherlips was an honored war chief among the people. And we have another record of another well-honored war chief at the same time. They were almost figures of mythology within the nation. Leatherlips was one, and another war chief by the name of Big Tree. Big Tree was identified as being very elderly when the Methodist missionaries got into Upper Sandusky. He was crippled. It's likely that Leatherlips also had some type of disfigurement or something that didn't allow him to serve. But Leatherlips was indeed a war chief.
Thank you. And then a follow-up to that, the other part of the story is they say the reason, and I think you said it, but I had to step away for a minute. The reason why Leatherlips was in this area of Dublin was because this is where he wanted to live. He wanted to live among his white friends. But did I hear you say he was there and it's like more hunting? Like they make it, he didn't want to leave. He was there to just be with his white friends, and he wanted to make sure that they were safe and no one was going to molest them. And that's kind of why he was sticking around this area.
That's what the history books say.
Mm-hmm.
I have never seen, nor if you really look at the history of our people, we didn't position ourselves for the purpose of protecting the whites that came into Ohio. We positioned ourselves to protect ourselves, not the whites. So we had citizens that were spread out all through Ohio. Once the Treaty of Fallen Timbers went into play, not all of our citizens left the area that was designated for the Americans. We still had citizens, and Leatherlips being one of them, that basically was beyond the border of the treaty. There was a lot of controversy where even during the time when the Grand Reserve was put into play, we had citizens that still roamed all over the northern half of Ohio, because they had areas throughout the land that were very special to them, little areas that were sacred for one reason or another. And the area north of Dublin, where Leatherlips was his favorite place in Ohio. That is where he went. That is where he lived. That was his getaway. And he probably went there frequently, basically just to escape life. To say that he was there to protect the cells and all the other people that were there, no. He wasn't there to protect them. He was there basically to protect his own well-being, because that was his place. That's where he went to find peace and to prepare his inner spirit for who he was. So that is another one of those little myths, that he was there to protect the whites. Did he cause them any problems? Absolutely not. Did they befriend him? And did he befriend them? Absolutely.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It is a beautiful place. I understand that. And there's a very beautiful monument dedicated to him in Dublin. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with it.
Yeah,
It's quite beautiful. I don't know if
it's
it's appropriate, but it's pretty.
it definitely commands attention.
Mhm.
It gives Leatherlips the notoriety that he deserves to have. It serves well for him and for the nation in whole.
Good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If only they would leave Bill Moose out of it.
Yeah,
Don't get me started. He is also very popular in this area. It's
Yeah, and we try to tell them we have absolutely no record of the man, and they're just in love with his legendary stories.
Who's that, Kim?
Bill
Bill-
Moose.
Bill Moose.
Ah, okay, okay.
Basically, he ran away and as a child and joined the circus, and so he knew how to put on a show.
Yep, he was a showman. He knew how to manipulate. He did himself very well. He became a rock star, if you will. And in Ohio, he is very famous for being the last Wyandotte in Ohio, which no matter what we do, no matter what we say, he is so established in tradition and folklore that to basically root him out would be almost impossible. And hopefully when people do begin to look at the story of Bill Moose and they get interested in him and they start looking at the Wyandotte people, and they, like most people who look at our history, our traditions, they fall in love with us. They want to know more. So hopefully people find out through that draw that Bill Moose has, they find out more about who we are truly as a people. So he's not somebody that we recognize, but he is definitely somebody that can draw others to recognize us.
I actually, at the Wyandotte County Museum, is that what it's called there in Upper Sandusky?
Mhm.
I asked, Ron, I think is his name, if he would take that down, and he did. It's because there in the museum it had the last living Wyandotte, or the last full blood Wyandotte or something that was in Ohio, and it had his picture. I said, could you take that down? That's not, we don't have any records of him. And he did.
I can remember the first time I went up to Upper Sandusky, went through the museum and had a few conversations with a few of the people. They were trying to be very polite and congenial and accommodating of us being there, but they wanted to tell us our own history. And I've noticed over the years, if we've become more knowledgeable in our history, they are more than willing, like you've just noted, to change some of their ideas on that history. So they have helped us and we have helped them. And we talked about bringing them down during the gathering. And I think that's a wonderful idea because they have worked diligently for decades and decades and decades to preserve the history of our people when we ourselves struggle to know the history of our people. But now we know a lot.
Yes, thank you, Lloyd. I'm going to stop the recording, but then if anybody else has questions, they're